Well, good morning. Welcome to day 2 of CRF Park's annual conference. I've got the pleasure this morning of hosting Susan Goldsworthy, who is Affiliate Professor of Leadership and Organizational Change at IMD. So in terms of process, the session will be about 40 minutes input from Susan, followed by 20 minutes Q&A, and we'll finish after an hour. So for questions, what you need to do is to use the general chat line, and you don't have to say anything, but use the chat. And at the end of her input, I will relay the questions to Susan, and she'll answer with complete authority. So one other point of admin, later this week, you will all receive a copy of the event retrospective, and that will be a summary of what everyone said, together with a full recording of everybody's presentations. So I guess that's my full and frank introduction, Susan. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Mike. And hello, everyone. And thank you very much for joining for this session, Choluteca, Change and the Illusion of Control. And so let's talk a little bit. Let's move to the next slide. I'm going to, they're advancing for me, so I'm going to be saying that as we go through. If we move to the next slide, the question here is, what are the myths of leadership? And so in a changing world, and there's, even before COVID, the world was changing, but maybe we didn't need to acknowledge it as much, whereas now you can't not recognize the changing. And so here the question is, what are some leadership myths that need debunking? And so the idea that, for example, the leader has to have all the solutions, the leader is the expert, the idea that there's no place for emotions at the top, right? The leader has to be the rock, and the idea that it's lonely at the top. And so I want to talk to you about what's happening in the world, in organizations and with leadership, and the need to change that is without question as we go forward, and the challenges that that's going to bring us, I think. So if we move to the next slide, I was fortunate to do some research with a couple of my IMD colleagues, which formed the basis of a book called Care to Dare, with Professor George Colreiser and Professor Duncan Coombe. And what we found from this research is that to have consistent high performance, what we called in the playing to win zone, you have to have high caring, respect, support, and connect, as well as stretch and challenge and daring, right? So it's the care and the dare that give you high performance. When you're in that spot, it releases productive energy. So it's very playful. It's where curiosity, innovation, and creativity come to the fore. And so really important for organizations and individuals and teams to work, how can we be in this place, right? Where we are respecting each other. So caring doesn't mean liking. It's not about being friends. It's about what Rogers called an unconditional positive regard, right? So you have every right to be in the universe at the same time as me, simply because you're alive. So basic human respect, and then the stretch and challenge to perform, to go out of your comfort zone. Now, you can't spend all your time in play to win, right? We all need downtime. And so that's where we go into play not to lose, where we keep the connections, we keep the bonds, we keep the relationship, but we may back off the challenge for a little bit to recover, yeah? That's fine for a short period of time, but if you spend too long down there, then the organization becomes complacent, and what got us here won't get us there, or even keep us here in today's world. And so important to then step back up with the challenge. Now at IMD, and I'm sure with a lot of your organizations, where we see a lot of executives fall is in the play to dominate, particularly under stress, right? Which is focus on results, drive the performance, but they step off the relationship. And the problem with this is a corrosive energy. So it's micromanagement, it's over control. It's, it's quicker and easier to do it myself. I just tell them what to do, get it done, right? Now, the problem with this is when a leader goes into that mode, then the employees go into play to avoid. They say, he, she wants to do it all themselves, let them. I'll come in, do my job and go home. And then the leader looks at them and says, see, they're not capable. I have to do it myself. And you get what's called a set up to fail syndrome, right? So it starts a downward spiral. Now, what we're seeing in today's world, if we go to the next slide, is energy is becoming, how people are managing their energy with this new virtual world, with all the pressures, both economic, but also the working from home, the social distancing. What we're seeing is that really important for people to be able to manage their energy and to be able to talk about it. And we're going to be talking more about the importance of talking about it. But here you can see the performance zone maps on the play to win, right? So this is where people feel hopeful, they feel confident. You've got the recovery zone, that's the chilling, that's the, even sleep is in recovery zone. You've got the survival zone, which is where there's frustration, anxiety, irritation. And then you've got the burnout zone, which is where, people believe it's hopeless, start getting depressed, a sense of despair. Yeah. And so what we're going to do, if we move to the next slide, what I'm going to ask you to do here is we have a poll. So I'm going to ask you to vote on where do you feel you've been spending most of your time in the last 3 months. It is anonymous, so please, answer truthfully. And then I'll share, I've been doing this survey for several months now, and I'll share the results that I'm seeing from all different organizations around the world. So if you could choose one of the 4 options, performance, recovery, survival, or burnout. And I'm just having a look here at how the results are coming through. Let's have a look. Okay, so at the moment we've got 35%. Bear with me 1 second. I'm gonna. Yeah, so we've got still coming in 41% survival, 28%, 31% performance, 14% burnout, 14% recovery. Okay, that's just going up a bit. So what? Okay, yeah. Okay, so let's hold the poll there. What we've got is pretty equal between performance and survival, and then sort of 15% equal on the burnout and the recovery. Now, this is really interesting, right? Because this has major implications for organizations and how they are operating on a day-to-day basis. And if we go to the next slide, what you can see here is the results from the surveys I've been doing with a variety of large multinational companies around the world, and some medium companies as well around the world. Most are global, international. Some are more European based, right? And you can see here that around 45 to 50% say they're in the performance zone. You've got 25 to 30% are in the recovery zone, but you've got 15 to 20% in survival and 3 to 5% in burnout, right? So what this means is that, 30% of your leadership workforce are in a state of survival or burnout. This is serious stuff, right? And so the question becomes, how do we work together to create an environment that supports people who are clearly challenged, right? And how can the people in performance zone connect with those people and help them through what they're dealing with? So if we move to the next slide, I'm going to share with you some of the neuroscience behind change here. And I just want to share with you this wonderful story, which is the Choluteca that's in the headline, which is that in Honduras, there is a city called Choluteca, and it has a bridge. You can see it there in the top left of the picture. And they have hurricanes. They're in a hurricane area, right? And whenever a hurricane comes through, it destroys the bridge. So in 1995, they put out a tender globally for a company to create a bridge that could withstand a hurricane. And for the first time, an Asian company won a bid for Latin America. It was a Japanese company. And they built the bridge, and it was opened in 1998. And a few months after it opened, a hurricane came through and the bridge was totally undamaged. So it completely withstood the hurricane. And yet, if we go to the next slide, you see what happens. So here is the bridge, totally perfect, but the river moved from the hurricane, right? And so, this is this idea, humans, we like to manage our sense of uncertainty. We need to manage our sense of helplessness and meaninglessness by having a sense of control and certainty. But even if you do everything right, today's world, things can change. And so this is this importance of not only staying flexible, adaptable, innovative, creative in this secure-based space, but also of having those connections and bonds and creating the psychological safety where people feel safe enough to share how they're feeling. So if we go to the next slide, I use Roger because I live in Switzerland and I've just been watching the French Open and he wasn't playing. But, you know, this is the importance of having secure bases and a growth mindset as opposed to a fixed mindset. And so one of the challenges here is that a lot of our education is very much around a fixed mindset, right, wrong, good, bad, black, white, right? And so a lot of training, especially with a lot of people who are either with a scientific background or an engineering background, can be quite rigid. And so the challenge is to have this growth mindset, you know, what's possible? We're not there yet, the curiosity. Because the solutions that might have worked in the past are clearly not going to be solutions. We may not even know the future solutions, right? And we have to work together to help those emerge. And in order to do that, we have to feel safe enough. And so there's a lovely story about lobsters. I didn't know this until relatively recently. I don't know if you know, but how do lobsters grow? Yeah. And so the way a lobster grows is it's a soft, mushy white creature inside a shell. Yeah. And so it grows and it starts butting up against the shell. It starts feeling uncomfortable. So that's a stimulus for growth, is discomfort. So what it has to do is it sheds its shell, it grows bigger, and then it grows a new shell. But if it sheds its shell in open water in the sea, it's going to be eaten, right? And so it has to find a safe space, a cliff, a cave or a rock, a secure base, as we call it, where it feels safe enough to be vulnerable, to shed its shell, and then it can grow and come out again. And so this is very much the concept of a secure base and a secure base environment, is how do we create this space where people feel safe enough to share what's really worrying them or concerning them in order to give them a sense of autonomy, which then can move them forward. So if we go forward to the next slide, another poll for you. We have our dancing octopus for the poll. Which is the most natural for the human brain? Is it to focus on the positive or is it to focus on the negative? So again, if you could vote, you have a choice of two here. And let's see how we're vote. I can see here that most people are putting the negative. We have a few optimists in the room who are putting the positive, but most have gone with the negative, and absolutely spot on. You know, the number one job of your brain, so we exit the poll, the number one job of your brain is to keep you alive, right? And therefore, people will naturally focus on the negative to make sure survival, yeah? Once they've done that, they can then switch and look at the positive. And so what we're going to do is we're going to see a video clip here. And this is of a gentleman called Adam Walker. And he's a swimmer. And his goal was to swim the 7 oceans around the world. He completed 6, and he's on the 7th in this video. And he's in the Cook Strait. It's November 2018. And he's swimming along. And suddenly he's surrounded by some dolphins, which is rather wonderful. We all like dolphins, right? But tagging along is a great white shark. Now, the problem is if he leaves the water and gets out, then all the swims are null and void. Nothing counts, right? So he has to stay in the water. And you see what happens.
Suddenly, Adam is surrounded by a group of dusky dolphins. It's magical. But tagging along is an unwelcome guest. A great white shark. When he spots it, his first thought is, get back to the support boat. But his dolphin companions form a barricade around him, and the shark retreats.
I can't leave the water. If I leave the water, the swim's over, and everything that I've trained for finishes. I had a choice. I either focus on the shark or I focus on the dolphins. I chose the dolphins.
So yeah, so if we go to the next slide, this is the wonderful thing, right? I have a choice. I focus on the shark or I focus on the dolphins. I chose the dolphins. Now, what's really important here, if we can bring the next slide up, is that you don't ignore the shark, right? That's suicidal, yeah? And so you cannot ignore the negative, right? We have to acknowledge that, recognize it, and then the challenge, if we move to the next slide, the challenge for the organization and for the individual, and it's a daily choice and a daily challenge, is to acknowledge the negative. Yep, there's the shark, and then look for the opportunity, right? Look for something I can do within. So I acknowledge what I'm concerned about, what concerns me, but I can't influence potentially. And then I focus on what can I influence, because then that moves me from a state of helplessness into a state of being able to act, which gives you agency, which is far healthier for the human brain. So if we move, I'm going to share with you, moving to the next slide, I'm going to share with you this model. It's based on the neuroscientific principles. So if we could move, so the change curve, you all know the change curve, right? And so this is adapted for business. So stage 1 is shock, denial, and anger. Oh no, this can't happen, it's outrageous, right? Stage 2, resistance, sadness, fear, and panic. I don't like it. I like it the way it used to be. Why can't we go back? How will I cope? Stage 3 is searching, rationalization, questioning. Okay, so this is not going away. Okay, how do I be part of it? What does this mean for me? And stage 4 is then the solutions, acceptance, and reattachment. So it's moving ahead, either where you are or somewhere else. But it's focused on, okay, I've accepted it, I move on, right? Now, we all know we bounce back and forth the curve, right? So it's not linear. Yeah, it's like a pinball machine, right? And things can send us back and forth. But one of the really interesting things in working with leaders is I find that leaders are very much like Homer Simpson. So I'm going to show you a short clip, and the question here is, why are leaders like Homer Simpson? So if we play the clip.
You can expect to go through 5 stages. The first is denial.
No way, because I'm not dying.
Second is anger.
You little bastard!
After that comes fear.
What's after fear? What's after fear?
Bargaining.
Doc, you got to get me out of this. I'll make it worth your while.
Finally, acceptance.
Well, we all got to go sometime.
Mr. Simpson, your progress astounds me.
So yeah, what do leaders have in common is that they tend to go through the change curve more quickly, right? So they tend to be solutions oriented. They're looking for, when something happens, they're looking for a solution, how to fix it. Yeah, we talked about before, this sort of fixed mindset, right? Let's fix things, let's solve things, let's move forward. The problem with this is it creates a disconnect between people who are feeling in shock, denial, and anger. And if we click a couple of times, you'll get the way the change curve lags, right? So you've got employees and you've got middle managers tend to lag a little bit behind where the leaders are. And so this is why it's so important for leaders to allow people to express what they don't like. And so this is a little bit counterintuitive for leaders because they've been told to, focus on the positive, drive things through, have lots of energy, not to dwell in what is not going well or what's not appreciated, right? But if you don't do that, then you create a disconnect and then you lose even more people, yeah? And so I'm going to talk about this model. We move forward to the next slide. So this is the FACE model, and it's how do you manage your state, right? So how can you help yourself and people around you in the organization to manage state? And this works individual, team, organization, societal, right? So we have these 4 triggers based on the neuroscience principles of fairness, autonomy, certainty, and empathy. Now, we all have them, though for some of us, one will be stronger than another, and they actually interplay. So if one of them is hit particularly hard, for example, at the moment, certainty is clearly a button that we're all feeling hit on, you can use the other three to help to balance, right? So let me quickly take you through these one by one, because I think there's some wonderful material in here that exemplifies why it's so important to have this counterintuitive approach to actually open into dialogues with people around what is concerning them, around what is worrying them. So if we move to the next slide, the first one is fairness. I'm going to go through them one by one. So fairness, we all have the need to express, and human beings, and not just human beings, those of you that have pets, you know that dogs and cats can have a sense of fairness as well, particularly dogs. They're a social species. So social species very much have this sense of fairness. Now, what we've seen from the neuroscience is that if you allow people to express what they don't like, so if you allow someone to say, I don't think that's fair, or I don't like this, it reduces the negative emotion in the amygdala. So they're less upset because they've been given the space to say that they're upset. And so, you know, this is really interesting, because when I work with leaders, they're sort of hesitant of allowing people to vent the bad news. But if you don't give people the space, the bad news is going to happen anyway. It'll just go to the coffee machines, or it will go, you know, on the sidelines, and then productivity will go down, right? And so it's really important to allow people the space and opportunity, and also to share what's bothering you as well, right? So you can connect with them. So a space where everybody can share what is bothering them, what don't they like. And we're not trying to fix it. That's really important, right? We're not trying to solve it. We're creating an environment where you can express it. Once you've expressed, once you've allowed the expression, go have a cup of tea or coffee, walk away, right? And often what we do with organizations, we do it on Post-it notes. So you have a session where you say, okay, everybody, this side of the room, let's write down all the things that concern us, all the things that bother us that we can do nothing about, right? Let's put them all down there. So we put them all up, look at them, okay, now let's go get a cup of coffee or tea, switch state, we come back in, and now over here, we're going to write up all the things that we can do something about, all the things we can influence. And so this leads to the next one, if we click to the next slide, which is autonomy. And so human beings need the freedom to act, right, in order to remain healthy. So, I mean, you probably know that, you know, learned helplessness, Martin Seligman's work, that if people are, for example, kept in hospital for an extended period of time where they're looked after, or in old people's homes where every need is taken care of, very quickly we learn to be helpless. We learn to stop looking after ourselves. This is why it can be very healthy for people to have a plant to look after, or a pet if they're capable, right? Because it gives you something outside yourself that gives you a sense of acting, doing something. And this is really important for the human brain. All living organisms have what's called the activating tendency, which again is Carl Rogers' work, where any living organism wants to grow and flourish. What makes a difference as to how well it grows and flourish, for example, if we take a sunflower seed will grow between paving stones, but it won't grow as well between paving stones as it would if it was in a field with rich nutrients, right? And so the conditions we are in create the difference between how well we can flourish, but we all want to grow. We all want to develop, right? And LinkedIn did a study where they asked thousands of people, would you rather have a 20% pay increase or more autonomy at work? And more than 50% of respondents said more autonomy versus a 20% pay increase. So, you know, this is so important. Give people choice, give people options, because that within the frame. So we often say, you know, leaders define the boundaries, right? You know, if you've got children, you don't take them to a 3-lane high or 4-lane highway and say, off you go and play, right? You take them to a playground and then you say, off you go and play. And then they can play within the frame, right? So the leader set the frame, but then you've got to give freedom and opportunity for people and options and choices in order to act. And this releases healthy chemicals into the brain and takes us out of that state of unfairness. And so this model of, you know, on the wall, here are the things that concern us, here are the things that we can do and we can influence, and then let's decide together what are we going to work on, really helps to move people out of that burnt out survival place, right, and move them back across. If we go to the next one, this is the one that today, obviously, we're seeing everywhere, which is certainty or uncertainty. So human beings have a strong need to know, right? Why? Number one job of the brain is to keep you alive, right? So uncertainty is the biggest threat. If I know, at least I know. So I can deal with good news and I can deal with bad news. What I cannot deal with is not knowing over a substantial period of time. And, you know, there was an organization just along the lake here in Switzerland where many years ago where they went through an acquisition. And for 18 months, people didn't know whether they were going to have a job or not. Now, a lot of people chose to leave, right? Autonomy. So they said, okay, I'm out of here. I'm going to go do something else. But a number of people couldn't leave because maybe, you know, they needed to stay in the area or it was a second job. And what they saw was the incidence of serious illness actually went up quite dramatically in that time. So uncertainty is extremely unhealthy for the human brain. And the scientists did this experiment where they had people come in and they were wired up to measure stress response, and they were also hooked up to a shock machine, right? Not a heavy shock, but a light shock, right? And they had a computer screen, and on the screen were 12 stones. And what they had to do, their task, was to click on a stone with the mouse, and the stone would flip. And what they said to them is, if you flip a stone and there's a snake behind it, the first group, they said to them, you definitely won't get an electric shock. Don't worry. If you get a snake, you get a snake, right? The second group, they said, if you get a snake, you will get an electric shock, right? And the third group, they said, if you get a snake, you may or may not get an electric shock, right? And what they saw was that the stress response on number 3 was dramatically higher than number 1 or 2. Number 1, of course, I'm not going to get a shock, so it doesn't matter. Number 2, I know. So I see a snake, here it comes, ow, right? It's done. 3, I don't know. So for that moment, I'm in an extremely uncertain environment where I'm releasing, you know, 12 to 18 chemicals into my system, including cortisol and adrenaline, getting me ready for flight, which again is taking the blood away from the brain, right, into the large muscles. So I can't think straight, putting me into a very uncertain situation. And so, you know, this is where it's really difficult for people to deal with uncertainty. And in today's world, what are we dealing with? Is massive uncertainty. And so this is why it's really important to be able to work with the fairness, the autonomy, and then the fourth one, which is empathy. And so if we move to this one, and again, this counters the myth, if we move to the next slide, this counters the myth that, you know, you mustn't show emotion, you mustn't have EQ at the top, right? And I know for many of you, you've been working with this for years, but you'd be amazed at how many senior leaders still believe they have to be, you know, rational, logical, non-emotional, right? What we see, again, from the neuroscience is that if someone is excluded socially, it lights up the same part of the brain as physical pain. And so the brain doesn't distinguish. When someone says, I feel hurt, actually they are feeling hurt, right? It's the same part. And so what you see in times of uncertainty is there's a need to up the social contact. There's need to up how to connect, right? And so we say here, you know, creating opportunities for people to collaborate and get together. And what we're seeing here in now with COVID is professionally, but also personally, also socially. And so, you know, making sure that the leader is taking time to check in with how people are doing outside of the role and the job, yeah? It becomes really important. And the beautiful thing about this model is that you can actually leverage the other ones when one of them is lower. And so this is why in today's world, we've really got to think about how do we manage fairness? How do we create opportunities for people to feel autonomous, to have a sense of what they can do? And also, how can we increase the empathy in an uncertain world? And because what happens is if you create this secure base where people feel psychologically safe, even if it's uncertain, they feel healthier because they feel that if there is something, you will tell them or you'll support them, or you'll be there for them, right? And so this is why it's so important to work particularly now, and I think going forward in the future, because I don't think it, this is not going away in the sense of, the world is changing, and the models that have worked for us in the past are not going to work for us in the future, because we have a finite planet, right? And we are overshooting on a number of criteria, hence we have our SDGs behind us. We really have to work in a different way in order to ensure not just our survival, but the survival of many other species on the planet. So if we walk to the next one, to the next slide, we've got a poll again. Which of these is the strongest at your work today? So not for you. Sorry, go back one. It's the first one we need. So we have two polls. So the first one is, which is the strongest at work today? Not for you, but for your people, do you think, in the culture? So if you could vote on that. How are we doing? Let's have a look here. Oh, wow, great. Okay. So no surprise that certainty is the lowest. Oh, actually, no, it's coming up a bit. That's interesting. So what we have there is, I'm just trying to see it. I'm going to make it a little bit bigger. My eyes are. Okay, so this is interesting. So in a number of your organizations, there's a strong sense of certainty, which is interesting because that's actually been the lowest when I've done this again with other organizations. Autonomy and empathy are coming out the highest, and certainty is by a long way the lowest. So interesting, the fairness one, which again might be indicative of then people being in survival and burnout, right? Because if you feel things are unfair, then that can affect your sense of being socially included as well, right? That I might be excluded, which then affects the certainty. Yeah. Okay, so let's ask one more, which is the most challenging at your work today? So if we vote again. Oh, the polls are the wrong way around, I'm being shown. We're answering the opposite to how you're answering. Okay, no worries. They were reversed. Okay, no worries. Thank you. That's helpful. I was going to say it was unusual. So now we have, this is the most challenging one, right? It says the strongest on the poll, but you mean challenging. Is certainty being the most challenged? I'm seeing that in the chat. So thank you, Charlotte and Angela, for flagging, and Louise. I really appreciate that. For challenging that. Yeah, no surprise that certainty is the most challenging, right? Yeah, by quite a long shot. And again, so this is this importance of then being able to work with the others in order to help counter that, because it is an uncertain world, right? Come back to the, and it's going to be continuing this way. And so the question is, how do we then imagine futures that we haven't even thought of yet? And the old way of leading is not going to help us get there, because it's not about having the answers. It's not about the top dictating. It's about co-creating across all levels. Yeah. And what we see here at IMD, which is quite interesting, is a number of younger people, MBA students, EMBA students, and younger people in organizations are actually coming up with quite creative ways in order to move things ahead. And so really important for the sort of more traditional, older top level to be listening and engaging with across the organization with all ages in order to be able to work this. So if we move to the next slide, And all the slides will be shared with you. I just want to share a very quick example of a leader that I've had the privilege of working with for a number of years. And we've just written a leadership case about Jan van Hossenbroek, who is the founding partner and managing partner of a Dutch consultancy, strategic consultancy called IGNH. It was a wonderful experience working with him as he went through a real sort of, I would say transformation, but as you're going to hear from him in a minute, that, it's a continual journey. It never ends, right? And so the importance for leaders to be self-aware. And again, we see, for a lot of leaders, it's a real challenge to look at themselves in the mirror because change starts with them. And what's worked to get them where they are is not going to be what's not just works for them in the future, but will keep us there, because I think things are changing so rapidly. We have to break down these barriers, the old stereotypes of what is leadership, and we have to start working together and across and get out of our own way. And the way to do that is to be conscious of our own shadows and our own downsides. And so if we just play the next, you can hear a little clip from Jan. Sorry, just before you start, we did the case, so it's a two-part case, and we created 2 videos with it as well. So this is a very short excerpt from a couple of the videos.
I realized that I felt lonely. I felt lonely at the top. I felt that I had to, I have to drag the whole company by myself, and was not able to talk about my personal problems as well. And the first time of my life, I had a feeling that I got stuck. So on a scale 1 till 10, I would say my leadership quality was maybe 10-50% when I was starting. I had a vision. And maybe now I would say 60-65%, but there's still 35% to go. So there are many areas where I can improve my leadership style. Many more mountains to climb, but I know the mountains now.
And so I love that. There's many more mountains to climb, but at least I know the mountains now, right? And so this is this importance of the self-awareness, and the looking at self and working with perhaps our shadow side or the things we haven't dealt with in order to be have this growth mindset of we're not there yet, and how are we going to adapt and change for the world that that is going to happen. How are we going to adapt and change so that we as a species can continue to flourish, and other species can also continue to flourish. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Mike for a Q&A. We're looking forward to having I've had a couple going on in the chat, which has been great. Love to dialogue with you. Any questions, any thoughts?
Loads of questions, loads of thoughts. I mean, you've given us enough to keep us going for a couple of weeks, I would think. I've got loads of questions for you here, but people have been developing leaders and managers for years and years and years, and I'm not sure it's an awful lot better, is it? I mean, so what are you recommending we do to help develop our leaders and managers?
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I think the problem is we've been developing people within the existing paradigm, within the existing frame, and that paradigm is no longer suited for the future. And so we really have to shift our whole framework of what is leadership. I would even go as far as saying, the word leadership, I think, has issues. The myth of the hero who's going to save us all, right? We have to instead think perhaps about stewardship, protecting. How do we protect what we can? And how do we co-create? How do we work together to move forward? And so this is very much linked to systemic thinking. And some of you may know the work of Otto Scharmer and Senge and Joanna Macy. But business as usual is the old paradigm, and we're seeing it crumbling around us. And so the challenge is, what comes next is, in Macy's terms, like the great unraveling. And in that is going to be grief, loss, despair, uncertainty. And so we have to create these psychologically safe environments where it's okay for that, because otherwise we are seeing a massive, and you're already seeing this in the news already, right? Mental health issues are growing, right? And so how do we manage this place so we're actually supporting? And again, the role of organizations in this, I think, is organizations have a responsibility as a community, right? And so that's that's a whole different discussion and topic, but I think they do they've become global. They've become these, powerful places where a lot of the issues that we're having are from overconsumption. And so how do we think about going from the linear economy to the circular economy? And what does that mean for people? So I don't know if that helps answer
we
it.
Can't let you off with that. I mean, you've got to go back to it again.
Okay, good.
So the question is, we know the context is changing and we know that circumstances are different now, but how should we be thinking about developing these leaders? What's changed in terms of leadership development?
So what I'm seeing here is this thing around, again, coming back to these myths. Yeah. So, the leader has to have solutions. Not necessarily, right? The leader has to create the environment where solutions can emerge. Yeah. Rather than being the expert who says, this is what we need to do. So that's one. Leader being lonely at the top. If you're lonely at the top, it's because you're not connecting with people. You're not a secure base and you don't have secure bases around you. So how can you cultivate secure bases around you? Sometimes you hear leaders say, well, there's nobody who's good enough to be a secure base for me. That's a defensive strategy. That's the brain protecting them from fears. Yeah. And so this is where it's working with the inner voices of judgment, cynicism, and fear, and instead thinking compassion, curiosity, and possibility. And so we need to train leaders to let go of what they've been schooled in, judgment, cynicism, and fears, and across to this more co-creating environment. Yeah. I don't know if that helps, Mike.
Creating the environment, I think, is a great expression. So a couple of questions here from Fiona McCabe. Has the research shown any differences between male and female leadership quality, old versus new way, and self-awareness? Is the gender or generational divide more significant?
Great, good question. Thank you very much. Yeah, and sorry, I'm just checking the name was Fiona, right? Yeah. It's interesting because I would split it away from male and female and to masculine and feminine, right? So the attributes that we tend to give, it doesn't matter whether you're male or female. Some males can be more feminine than some females, right? So it's not necessarily tied to gender, but it is tied to characteristics and qualities. And so, we're seeing, in order for us to survive as a species, and it's that critical, right? We have to move from competition to collaboration, which is away from domination and conquering and winner takes all, to how do we work together, how do we co-create, and how do we bring diversity in? Because one way is not going to do it. It needs to be multiple ways. We know that for any living system to be healthy, it has to be diverse. If you take away all the diversity, eventually the predator dies because it's got nothing to eat, right? And so you need diversity. And so again, how can we embrace what we've been, in a sense, moving away from? And what we've done, I think, what I see in leadership and in organizations is where there is movement in this way, but what's happened is it's been put in departments. So you have the sustainability department, or you have the diversity department, right? And it's then outsourced to them as their responsibility. Absolutely not. This is responsibility at the very top. The very top has to be, the chief inclusion officer. They have to be the chief sustainability officer. They have to be talking about this stuff on a daily basis. And if they're not focusing on the critical issues.
And one big word you used a couple of times in your presentation was autonomy. What
Yes.
do you mean by autonomy?
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I mean, what's really important for human beings is to have a sense of agency. So we know that if you feel you have a choice, it makes you healthier, right? So you're in a better state. So, I mean, if you go back to the work of Viktor Frankl, for example, Man's Search for Meaning, he says you can have everything taken away from you. You know, he was interred in the concentration camps, right? And he says everything can be taken from you except your attitude, right? And what he saw in the concentration camps was those people who had a sense of connection, either to other people or to a bird or to something, some living entity, had a sense of being able to still retain what they thought about, rather than moving to a state of helplessness. We're in a healthier state in those moments, right? And so the importance of having a sense of agency, if I can choose, if I can do something, I'm going to feel better. Yeah. Now, hopefully it's doing something that's moving in the right direction. And that's, again, the role of the leadership is to make sure that these actions that people can take are helpful ones. Yeah. But agency is really important for individuals. So the sense of autonomy, I can act, I can do something.